My name is Liam Sterling. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, I've existed in a space people rarely question. The background. I'm the one who adjusts, the one who listens more than he speaks, the one who is always assumed to be fine, even when no one actually asks. If you were to meet me through my family, you probably hear words like responsible, independent, and mature for his age. Those words sound like compliments. For a long time, I thought they were, but what they often meant was something else entirely, that I didn't need support, that I wouldn't object, that I could carry weight quietly while others were allowed to struggle loudly. People tend to underestimate me because I don't compete for attention. I don't dramatize pain. I don't demand to be chosen. And in families like mine, that combination can slowly turn into an unspoken agreement, one where expectations grow, but appreciation stays exactly where it is. This story isn't about resentment. It's not about proving anyone wrong, and it's definitely not about revenge. What I'm sharing is something more uncomfortable than that. A long, honest look at how imbalance becomes normal, how love can quietly attach conditions, and how dignity can be mistaken for obligation. There was a sentence my parents once said, almost casually, that stayed with me far longer than they probably intended. My parents said I owed everything to my brother, not because he demanded it, not because they were cruel, but because they believed, genuinely, that life had been harder on him. And because I seemed capable, I was expected to absorb the difference. That belief shaped the rhythm of my life. It influenced who spoke first, who was forgiven faster, whose mistakes were framed as learning experiences, and whose silence was taken as consent. It taught me that fairness was flexible and that being the stable one meant stepping aside without complaint. What follows in this video isn't a dramatic escalation. There are no explosive arguments, no villains delivering speeches. Instead, it's a slow accumulation of moments, small cuts that didn't bleed enough to alarm anyone else, moments that were easy to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore when stacked together. You'll hear how I accepted a role I never consciously chose, how I learned to stay quiet, not because I was weak, but because I was taught that harmony mattered more than honesty, and eventually, how that same silence became something else entirely, not avoidance, but clarity. At the center of this story is a realization that didn't arrive with anger, but with calm certainty. Debt of dignity doesn't exist. No one is entitled to your self-respect. Not family, not history, not even love. Support given freely is generosity. Support demanded indefinitely becomes erasure. I'm telling this story without embellishment, without revenge fantasies, and without asking you to take sides. I'm sharing it because there are many people who live this quietly, who are praised for being easy, reliable, and understanding, while slowly disappearing inside those labels. So before we go any further, let me ask you something, not rhetorically, but honestly. Have you ever realized that being the strong one was the reason no one noticed when you were being treated unfairly? To my family, I was never the problem, and that, I would later understand, was the problem. I was the son who didn't need reminders, the one who finished homework without being asked, who didn't slam doors, who didn't spiral when things went wrong. If something needed to be done, moving furniture, filling out forms, stepping in during awkward moments. I did it without commentary, not because I enjoyed it, but because it felt easier than explaining why I shouldn't have to. My brother, on the other hand, was always becoming better, becoming stable, becoming responsible. His life was framed as a work in progress, and that framing excused a lot. Missed commitments were phases, harsh words were stress, financial mistakes were learning experiences. Everyone spoke about him with a mixture of concern and hope, as if his future required constant investment. I didn't. I was spoken about in the past tense, even while I was sitting in the room. Liam's always been good with money. Liam understands. Liam doesn't mind. Those sentences were never questions. They were conclusions. And once a family agrees on a conclusion, it becomes remarkably efficient at protecting it. At gatherings, conversations naturally flowed around me. Plans were discussed, decisions made, assumptions confirmed, all with the quiet confidence that I would adapt. If something went smoothly, it was expected. If something went wrong, it was usually traced back to my brother's circumstances, never to the structure that kept putting pressure on him while leaning on me to stabilize the outcome. I didn't feel abused. That's important to say. There was no cruelty in the obvious sense, no raised voices telling me I mattered less. Instead, there was something subtler, an invisible hierarchy of need. And in that hierarchy, I was always at the bottom, not because I was weak, but because I was perceived as capable. Capability, I learned, can be a liability. When resources were limited, time, money, emotional energy, they flowed upward toward whoever appeared most fragile. I was never fragile, or at least I never showed it. So I became the buffer, the one expected to understand why something wasn't fair right now, the one reminded that family meant sacrifice, and that sacrifice looked different depending on who you were. If I ever hinted at discomfort, it was met with surprise rather than curiosity, as if I had broken character. My parents didn't dismiss me outright. They reframed. You're stronger than this. You don't really need that. Your brother needs us more right now. Those sentences didn't sound like rejection. They sounded like praise. And that's why they were so effective. Over time, I internalized the role. I stopped offering preferences, stopped correcting assumptions. I learned to preempt disappointment by not wanting too much in the first place. It felt mature. It felt selfless. It felt like love. But invisibility has a cost. I began to notice that my presence was transactional. I was valued for what I provided: stability, solutions, calm, not for who I was becoming. No one asked what I wanted next. No one worried whether I felt supported. The unspoken logic was simple. If I wasn't struggling, I must be fine. And because I didn't want to compete with my brother's very real challenges, I stayed quiet. I told myself this was temporary, that once he found his footing, things would balance out, that fairness, like gravity, would eventually correct itself. What I didn't understand yet was that roles, once established, don't dissolve on their own. They harden. In my family, I was the reliable constant, the background structure everyone leaned on but rarely looked at. I was present, useful, and, increasingly, unseen. And the more consistent I was, the more permanent that invisibility became. This wasn't something I resented at first. It was something I accepted, even defended, because admitting it would have meant questioning the fairness of people I loved, and questioning whether being The good one had quietly taught them to expect my silence. At that stage, I still believed that understanding would be reciprocated eventually, that patience would be noticed, that doing the right thing without being asked would count for something. I hadn't yet learned how easily consistency can be mistaken for consent. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one said anything openly cruel. In fact, if I described it to someone else, they might struggle to understand why it mattered at all. That's usually how the first cut works. It happened over something small, money, technically, but not in the way people imagine. My parents were helping my brother cover a shortfall. Rent, I think. Or maybe a late payment. The details shifted, depending on who told the story, which should have been my first clue. What mattered was that it was urgent, and it mattered that it was his. I was already there when the conversation started, sitting at the kitchen table, half listening, half absorbed in my own thoughts. I remember the tone more than the words, concern layered with reassurance, urgency softened by excuses. My brother was tense, defensive. My parents were calm, practiced. This wasn't their first time navigating this situation. At one point, my mother looked at me and said, almost casually, "Liam, you're okay for this month, right?" It was phrased as a question, but it wasn't one. I paused, just long enough to notice the expectation in the room. My brother didn't look at me. My father was already nodding, as if the answer had been given. The conversation had a direction, and my role in it had already been assigned. "Yeah," I said, "I'm fine." And just like that, the conversation moved on. No one thanked me. No one asked what fine actually meant. No one acknowledged that this adjustment, whatever form it took, was something I had just agreed to without being offered an alternative. It wasn't framed as a sacrifice. It was framed as logistics. Later that night, I replayed the moment in my head, trying to understand why it felt heavier than it should have. I hadn't lost anything tangible. I wasn't in trouble. I wasn't even particularly inconvenienced. So why did it linger? Because it wasn't about the money. It was about how quickly my needs were removed from the equation, how seamlessly the room had shifted once my compliance was confirmed. The decision hadn't been made with me. It had been made around me, with the assumption that I would adjust. What struck me most was how invisible the moment was to everyone else. The next day, my parents were relaxed. My brother was relieved. The crisis had passed. There was no sense that anything had been taken from me, because nothing had been taken that anyone was trained to notice. I tried to tell myself it was reasonable. Families help each other. I was lucky to be in a position where I could absorb the impact. And all of that was true, technically. But something about the exchange had crossed a line I didn't yet have language for. It was the first time I realized that my consent was being assumed, not requested. From that point on, I started noticing patterns I'd previously ignored. How often I was checked in with only after decisions were already in motion. How my flexibility was treated as a constant, not a choice. How my brother's struggles were treated as urgent events, while my stability was treated as a permanent resource. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. I didn't even change my behavior. Outwardly, nothing shifted. Inwardly, though, a small record began forming. Not a list of grievances, more like a mental footnote. This mattered to you, I told myself, even if it didn't matter to them. That awareness didn't make me angry. It made me careful. I began to listen more closely, not just to what was said, but to what was assumed. I paid attention to how often my presence functioned as a safety net rather than a person. The first cut wasn't painful because of what it cost me materially. It was painful because it revealed something structural, that my role was so fixed, my agreement was no longer necessary to secure my cooperation. And once you see that, once you realize that your silence is being used as confirmation, you can't unsee it. I didn't know then that this moment would become a reference point, that I would return to it years later, recognizing it as the beginning of a pattern rather than an exception. At the time, all I knew was this: something small had shifted. Not in my family, in me. After that first moment, nothing changed on the surface, and that, in retrospect, was the most telling part. There was no follow-up conversation, no acknowledgement that I had adjusted my plans, no recognition that a line had been crossed, because, to everyone else, no line existed. Life continued as it always had. Holidays arrived, birthdays passed, conversations flowed with the same familiar rhythm. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have convinced myself I imagined the discomfort altogether. But once something is noticed, it has a way of repeating itself. Small things started stacking up, not dramatic enough to confront, not blatant enough to point to without sounding petty. Plans that assumed my availability without checking, decisions made in advance with a quick update afterward, are framed as inclusion. Requests that weren't phrased as requests, but as expectations wrapped in friendly language. You don't mind, right? You're flexible anyway. You understand how this is. Each sentence landed lightly on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. What made it difficult to resist was how reasonable everything sounded. Nothing was unfair in isolation. Each instance came with context, justification, and a quiet moral nudge. This is what good people do. And because I had already been labeled as reasonable, stepping outside that role felt like a breach of character. So I didn't. Instead, I rationalized. I told myself that families aren't transactional, that keeping score poisons relationships, that my brother's instability was temporary, and my reliability was simply a phase of life I happened to be in. I convinced myself that pointing out an imbalance would only create unnecessary tension, and that harmony was worth more than precision. That belief kept me quiet for far longer than I care to admit. Over time, I began anticipating what would be asked of me before it was voiced. I adjusted plans preemptively, budgeted my time and resources with the assumption that some portion would always be redirected elsewhere. This wasn't forced on me explicitly. It was learned behavior, a way of staying ahead of a disappointment by never fully committing to my own expectations. What troubled me most wasn't the sacrifice itself, it was how invisible it had become. The more consistently I complied, the less noticeable my contribution was. Reliability erased its own evidence. If I showed up, it was normal. If I didn't, it was inconvenient. Meanwhile, my brother's efforts, however small, were celebrated as progress. A completed task, a short period of stability, a promise kept once. These moments were discussed with optimism, sometimes even pride. I found myself clapping along, genuinely wanting him to succeed, even as I noticed the imbalance in how effort was measured. I wasn't angry at him. That distinction matters. My frustration wasn't directed sideways. It was structural. It was about a system that rewarded visible struggle more than quiet consistency, a system where being low maintenance slowly translated into being low priority. Occasionally, I tested the boundary without naming it. I delayed a response, declined a minor request, expressed mild hesitation instead of immediate agreement. The reactions were subtle, but consistent. Surprise, confusion, sometimes disappointment, as if I had violated an unspoken contract. Is everything okay? You're usually so on top of things. This doesn't sound like you. Those comments weren't accusatory, but they carried a message. Deviation required explanation. Compliance did not. Each time I retreated, not because I believed I was wrong, but because the cost of pushing felt disproportionate to the moment. I told myself I'd speak up when it really mattered, that this wasn't the hill to die on. But the thing about normalized disrespect is that it trains you to constantly postpone your own threshold. By the time something did feel significant, I had already spent years explaining away smaller versions of the same issue. The pattern was so established that questioning it felt like rewriting history. And history, once agreed upon by a group, resists revision. What I didn't realize yet was that my silence was being interpreted as endorsement, that my adaptability was no longer seen as generosity, but as proof that the arrangement worked. Every time I absorbed the imbalance without naming it, I reinforced the assumption that there was nothing to discuss. I was teaching people how to treat me patiently, consistently, and at my own expense. This period of my life wasn't marked by conflict. It was marked by normalization. The quiet kind, where nothing explodes, but something erodes. Where respect isn't taken all at once, but slowly redefined until you can't quite remember when it was last intact. And because there was no single moment to point to, no obvious offense to cite, I stayed. I adjusted. I kept the peace. I told myself I was being mature. I didn't yet understand that maturity without boundaries doesn't make you noble. It makes it convenient. It took me a long time to understand that I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being positioned. No one ever sat me down and explained my role. There was no announcement, no explicit agreement. It emerged gradually, shaped by repetition and reinforced by silence. By the time I noticed it clearly, the role had already solidified, and everyone around me was performing their parts with practiced ease. I was the stabilizer. In my family's story, I existed as the counterweight to chaos. When something went wrong, I was expected to absorb it. When plans shifted, I was expected to adjust. When emotions ran high, I was expected to stay calm. Not because I was asked to, but because that was who I had proven myself to be. And the more consistently I fulfilled that role, the less optional it became. My brother was allowed to be inconsistent. That inconsistency was treated as evidence of struggle, not irresponsibility. His setbacks were discussed with concern, his frustrations met with patience. When he failed, it was contextualized. When he succeeded, it was celebrated. I was allowed neither failure nor recognition. If I succeeded, it confirmed the assumption that I didn't need support. If I failed, it was surprising, sometimes even inconvenient, because it disrupted the balance everyone relied on. My competence wasn't just expected, it was required to keep the system functioning. Over time, I realized that my family didn't see me as someone with fluctuating needs. They saw me as infrastructure, reliable, unemotional, always there. Infrastructure isn't thanked, it's noticed only when it breaks. What made this role especially difficult to challenge was how morally justified it felt. I was often reminded, directly or indirectly, that I was the strong one, that I had my life together, that my brother needed more help right now. The implication was never that I mattered less, but that I was less urgent. Urgency became the currency of care. Because I didn't present as urgent, I was perpetually postponed. I started to see how decisions were framed. When something needed to be done, the question wasn't, who should do this, but who can handle this without falling apart? The answer was always me. And because I could handle it, it was assumed that I should. That's how responsibility quietly transforms into obligation. I also noticed how my identity was described to others. Extended family, friends, even casual acquaintances were told variations of the same story. Liam's got it together. We don't worry about him. He's so independent. These comments were offered with pride, but they came with a cost. They preemptively dismissed the possibility that I might need anything at all. Once an identity is broadcast like that, it becomes difficult to contradict without appearing ungrateful. So I didn't. I learned to compress myself into the role, to keep my struggles private, to solve problems alone, to present a version of myself that was consistently functional, even when it required effort. I became efficient at being unremarkable. The irony is that the more reliable I became, the more invisible my effort was. Consistency erased the story behind it. No one asked how much energy it took to stay composed. No one noticed the quiet recalculations, the postponed wants, the decisions I made to avoid becoming a burden. Because burdens were reserved for someone else at some point. I stopped seeing myself as someone who could ask for support. I began to see support as something that flowed in one direction, and I wasn't on the receiving end of it. This wasn't something anyone explicitly taught me. It was something I inferred from years of observation, and once internalized, it shaped how I moved through the world. I didn't challenge the role because it felt selfish to do so. I told myself that families aren't equal at every moment and that fairness doesn't always look symmetrical. I believed that being the dependable one was a form of love. What I didn't yet see was how that belief benefited everyone except me. The role I was assigned didn't ask whether I was willing, it assumed I would be. And because I never refused outright, the role hardened into expectation, then into entitlement. By the time I fully understood this, I wasn't just expected to be reliable. I was expected to remain invisible while doing it. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no accusation, no moment where I finally said what I'd been holding back and watched the room go silent. It was quieter than that, almost disappointingly so. I was alone when it happened, which feels appropriate now. I had just come home from work. Nothing remarkable about the day itself. Emails answered, problem solved. The familiar satisfaction of keeping things running smoothly without drawing attention to myself. I made dinner, ate standing up at the counter, and opened my laptop to check my accounts. This wasn't paranoia or obsession. It was a habit. Order was how I kept my head clear. As I reviewed my finances, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't even long. Just an update about my brother. He was going through another rough patch. Things were complicated. They were helping him again, for now. The message ended with something meant to be reassuring. You understand. I stared at that line longer than the rest of the message. Not because it was offensive, not because it was new, but because, for the first time, I didn't automatically agree with it. I closed the laptop, set the phone down, and sat there longer than I meant to. letting the silence stretch. There was no anger in me, just a strange stillness, like a room after furniture has been quietly removed. In that stillness, a question surfaced that I had never allowed myself to ask before. What happens if I stop understanding? Not dramatically, not by refusing help or cutting anyone off, just internally. What if I stopped translating imbalance into virtue? What if I stopped assuming that my capacity meant obligation? The thought didn't feel rebellious. It felt clarifying. I realized something unsettling then. No one had ever asked me whether this arrangement worked for me. Not once. Years of decisions had been made on the assumption that I would adapt. And I had. But adaptation had slowly replaced consent, and I had participated in that exchange without noticing when it happened. The shift wasn't emotional, it was cognitive. I saw the pattern in full for the first time, not as isolated moments, but as a system where my reliability subsidized someone else's instability, where my silence reduced friction, where my dignity was slowly being redefined as something I owed. And suddenly, a sentence formed in my mind with a clarity that startled me. Debt of dignity doesn't exist. I didn't feel triumphant saying it. I felt grounded, as if something had clicked into alignment. That night, I didn't respond to my mother's message right away. Not to punish her, not to make a point. I simply paused. I let the expectation hang without immediately fulfilling it. And in that pause, I noticed how uncomfortable it felt, not for them, but for me. I had been conditioned to respond quickly, to reassure, to smooth. Silence felt like disobedience, even when no rule had been stated. That realization mattered. Over the following days, I paid closer attention, not to my family, but to myself, to the automatic yes that rose in my throat before I evaluated a request, the way guilt surfaced the moment I imagined saying no, to how deeply I had internalized the idea that my role was to make things easier for everyone else. This wasn't resentment surfacing, it was awareness. I didn't confront anyone because I didn't yet know what I would say. Confrontation implies certainty, and I was still observing, still recalibrating, still learning to separate compassion from self-erasure. But something fundamental had changed. I stopped narrating my own behavior as virtue. I stopped congratulating myself for endurance. I began asking a different kind of question, not, can I handle this? But should I? The shift didn't make me colder, it made me precise. For the first time, I saw that my silence had been doing more than keeping the peace. It had been training people, quietly, consistently, that my boundaries were flexible, negotiable, optional. And if that was learned behavior, then so was its opposite. That night marked the end of something, though no one else knew it yet. The end of automatic understanding. The end of unexamined sacrifice. The end of assuming that love required invisibility. Nothing on the outside changed, not yet. But inside, the role I had been playing no longer fit the person I was becoming. And once that happens, returning to the old shape is impossible. Before that shift, my silence had been reflexive. It rose automatically, the way a trained muscle responds before thought catches up. I stayed quiet because that was how I kept things stable, how I avoided friction, how I preserved the image everyone relied on. Silence wasn't something I chose. It was something I inhabited. Afterward, it became deliberate. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't warn anyone that things were about to be different. I simply stopped filling in the gaps. When assumptions floated into the air, I let them sit there a moment longer than usual. When conversations turned toward what I would obviously handle, I paused before responding. Sometimes I still agreed. Sometimes I didn't. The key difference was that agreement was no longer automatic. And because no one expects a shift without a signal, my behavior was interpreted the same way my silence always had been, as compliance. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. I listened more than I spoke, not passively, but attentively. I paid attention to how often my family spoke about me rather than to me. How frequently were they framed as already settled by the time my input was invited? I noticed which requests were softened with appreciation and which were delivered as foregone conclusions. What struck me was how rarely anyone checked whether I had the capacity they assumed I did. Silence, when chosen, creates space. And in that space, patterns become visible. I also became more selective with my energy. Not dramatically, just precisely. I stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate last-minute needs that weren't actually emergencies. I responded to messages when it worked for me, not the moment they arrived. These weren't acts of defiance. They were acts of alignment. At first, no one noticed. Then they noticed, but misread it. You've been busy lately. You seem tired. Everything okay? Those questions weren't invitations to honesty. They were attempts to restore equilibrium. I could feel it, the subtle discomfort when I didn't immediately reassure, when I didn't jump in to smooth things over. My silence, once invisible, was becoming noticeable because it was no longer doing its old job. Still, I said very little. I was learning something important during this phase. People respond more to changes in behavior than to explanations. If I had tried to articulate my realization, it would have been debated, softened, reframed. But behavior is harder to argue with. It simply is. So I let my actions speak quietly. At the same time, I started documenting not people's mistakes, but realities, dates, numbers, commitments made and deferred, patterns of support given and rarely returned. This wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. I wanted to understand the structure I had been living inside without emotional distortion. What emerged was a clear picture. My contribution wasn't occasional, it was systemic. And systems don't collapse when one person steps back. They adapt, or they reveal their dependency. I didn't feel powerful during this period. I felt steady, calm in a way that wasn't performative. My silence wasn't about enduring anymore. It was about observing without interference. That calm unsettled people more than anger ever could have. My brother, in particular, seemed confused. He reached out more often, not to ask for help directly, but to reestablish familiarity. Casual check-ins, light humor, stories meant to remind me of our shared history. I responded politely, but without overextending. I didn't rush to reassure him that I was still there to catch him. Not because I wanted him to fall, because I wanted to see what happened when I didn't preemptively brace. This was the phase where silence stopped being interpreted as weakness, at least by me. I began to see it as a filter. Those who respected my autonomy adjusted without protest. Those who relied on my compliance grew uneasy. And that unease told me more than words ever had. I still cared. I still showed up. But I no longer erased myself in the process. And the more I practiced that restraint, the clearer it became how much emotional labor I had been performing to maintain an image that served everyone but me. Silence, when chosen consciously, isn't absence, it's boundary without announcement. And once I understood that, I realized something else. I didn't need to explain my worth to anyone who had benefited from my underestimating it. That understanding marked a turning point, not because I was withdrawing, but because I was finally present on my own terms. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was the accumulation of quiet choices happening out of view. From the outside, I still looked the same. I showed up when invited. I answered messages. I didn't argue or demand explanations. If anything, I seemed more composed than ever. That was the irony. My internal shift made me calmer, not colder. And because calm had always been my default, no one questioned it. But beneath that surface, I was preparing, not in a dramatic sense. There were no secret plans or whispered conversations. What I was doing was methodical, almost boring, and that's exactly why it went unnoticed. I began by tightening my own life, financially first. I separated accounts that had always been loosely shared or temporarily entangled. I reviewed old arrangements I'd agreed to casually and formalized them, or quietly ended them when they no longer made sense. Nothing abrupt, just clear. I also documented everything, not out of suspicion, but out of self-respect. If I were going to continue participating in this family dynamic, I wanted to understand its true cost. I tracked how often I stepped in, how frequently I adjusted, and how rarely the same flexibility flowed back toward me. Patterns became undeniable once they were written down. At the same time, I invested in myself in ways that didn't draw attention. I took additional certifications related to my work, strengthened skills that made me less replaceable, more autonomous. I expanded my professional network, not to climb, but to stabilize. Independence, I realized, isn't a personality trait, it's infrastructure. None of this was visible to my family. Why would it be? They weren't looking for it. In their mental model, I was already set. Growth, in their minds, was something my brother needed. I was simply maintaining. That assumption gave me space. I also started saying no, selectively, quietly, without justification. Not everything, just to things that crossed a line I was learning to recognize. The absence of explanation was intentional. Explanations invite negotiation. Boundaries, when acted on consistently, do not. The reactions were predictable: mild confusion, occasional frustration, but no confrontation, because confrontation requires someone to believe a rule has been broken. And as far as they were concerned, there were no rules, just habits. What they didn't notice was how much I was learning during this time. About leverage, not as power over people, but as freedom from dependence. About how often generosity becomes expected when it's never defined. About how systems resist change by appealing to emotion rather than fairness. I watched how quickly concern turned into pressure when my availability wasn't guaranteed. How appeals to family surfaced most often when someone needed something. How rarely the concept of reciprocity entered the conversation unless I raised it, and I no longer did. This wasn't bitterness, it was clarity, earned through distance. I also paid attention to how I felt. That was new. For years, I had overridden discomfort in the name of maturity. Now, I treated it as data. When something felt heavy, I didn't dismiss it. I examined it, asked what expectation was being placed on me, and whether I had agreed to it consciously. Most of the time, I hadn't. What surprised me was how little resistance there actually was when I stopped compensating. The world didn't collapse. My brother didn't spiral immediately. My parents didn't confront me. Instead, there was a subtle recalibration. They leaned elsewhere, deferred decisions, adjusted in small, reluctant ways. It became clear then. My role hadn't been essential because I was uniquely capable. It had been essential because it was convenient, and convenience, once removed, reveals alternatives. I was also careful not to announce my progress. No updates, no subtle boasts. Quiet dominance isn't about being seen, it's about being unmovable. The less I explained, the fewer openings there were for guilt to creep back in. I wasn't withdrawing from my family. I was withdrawing from the expectation that my dignity was a renewable resource they could draw from indefinitely. They didn't notice the shift because it didn't look like a rebellion. It looked like continuity, the same calm, the same restraint, the same reliability, just no longer at my own expense. By the time anyone sensed something was different, the groundwork had already been laid. Options I'd never allowed myself to consider were now real, not as threats, as possibilities. And that's the part they never noticed. While they assumed I would always be there in the same way, I was quietly making sure that my presence, when offered, was a choice, not a requirement. That preparation wasn't about leaving. It was about no longer being trapped. And once you reach that point, the balance of any relationship shifts, whether anyone else is aware of it or not. The reveal wasn't something I shared with anyone. There was no conversation, no announcement, no moment where I sat across from someone and watched their expression change. It happened entirely inside me. By the time it did, the groundwork had already been laid. The numbers were clear. The patterns are unmistakable. The quiet adjustments I'd been making had created space, financially, emotionally, structurally. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for impact. I wasn't factoring in someone else's instability as a variable in every decision. That's when I saw it. The leverage I had wasn't money. It wasn't information. It wasn't even distance. It was optionality. I realized that my family's confidence, their assumptions, their expectations, their casual certainty rested on one core belief: that I would always be there in the same way. That no matter how uneven things became, I would absorb the difference quietly, because that's who I had always been. But that belief only held if I continued to participate in it. The moment I stopped tying my sense of worth to being needed, the structure lost its grip on me. That was the private reveal. I could leave. Not dramatically, not angrily, not even physically at first. I could step back without collapsing anything. I could redefine my involvement on my terms. And most importantly, I could do so without asking permission. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm in a way I hadn't experienced before. The kind of calm that comes from knowing you're not trapped, even if you choose to stay. I tested it quietly. I imagined scenarios that would have once filled me with anxiety, saying no without explanation, prioritizing my own plans, letting someone else feel the discomfort of uncertainty. Each time, I noticed something surprising. My fear wasn't about their reaction. It was about breaking an identity I'd been praised for my entire life. Being the good one had been my armor. Letting it go felt like exposure. But the more I sat with it, the clearer it became. That armor had also been a cage. The private reveal wasn't just that I could change the dynamic, it was that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for doing so. My parents' belief that I owed everything to my brother wasn't a moral law, it was a narrative, one they believed in, one I had reinforced, and one I could quietly step out of. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If I weren't needed, would I still be wanted? The answer didn't come immediately, and I didn't rush it. I understood then that whatever the answer was, it would shape what came next, not in anger, but in alignment. I also realized that fairness wasn't something I needed to argue for. Arguments imply negotiation. What I needed was to live in a way that reflected my boundaries so clearly that they didn't require defense. That's what leverage really is. Not control over others, but freedom from their assumptions. I didn't celebrate this realization. There was no rush of vindication. If anything, there was a quiet grief, an acknowledgement of how long I had mistaken endurance for virtue, how thoroughly I had normalized being last in line for care. But there was also relief, because once you see that your dignity isn't something you owe, you can't unknow it. I thought back to all the moments I'd said yes automatically, all the times I'd been praised for understanding, for being mature, for not making things difficult. I saw those moments differently now, not as proof of my character, but as evidence of a system that depended on my compliance. And I understood something else too. If I changed, the system wouldn't thank me. It would resist. Guilt would surface. Confusion, appeals to history, to family, to everything except fairness. That didn't frighten me anymore. The private reveal wasn't about planning a confrontation. It was about accepting that whatever happened next, I would no longer participate in a dynamic that required my self-erasure. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to win. I just needed to choose myself, quietly, consistently, and without apology. That decision, made in solitude, changed the trajectory of everything that followed. No one else knew it yet, but the balance had already shifted. The decision didn't arrive as a sudden ultimatum. There was no moment where everything crystallized into a single dramatic choice. Instead, it emerged gradually, shaped by clarity rather than pressure. Once I understood that I had options, I couldn't pretend otherwise. I began to see the paths in front of me more clearly than I ever had before. I could continue as I was, slightly more reserved, a little more selective, but still fundamentally available in the way my family expected. That path promised familiarity, minimal conflict, the comfort of being praised for reliability, even if it came at a quiet cost. I could also confront the imbalance directly, sit my parents down, explain how the dynamic had affected me, name the assumptions, ask for change. That path appealed to my sense of fairness, but it came with risks I understood well. Conversations like that don't unfold in a vacuum. They invite defensiveness, reinterpretation, and emotional bargaining. They turn lived experience into something to be debated. And then there was the third option, the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. I could redefine my involvement without explanation, not disappear, not punish, simply step into a version of myself that is no longer oriented around being needed. Let my actions establish a new baseline. Accept whatever reactions follow without rushing to manage them. This option felt irreversible, not because it was extreme, but because it required me to let go of an identity that had protected me for most of my life. Once you stop being the dependable one, On demand, you can't go back to being praised for it in the same way. I sat with that truth for a long time. What made the decision difficult wasn't the fear of losing my family. It was the fear of losing my place in their story. The role I had played gave me certainty. It told me who I was to them. Stepping out of it meant entering ambiguity, being seen differently, or perhaps not at all. But ambiguity, I realized, was a small price to pay for self-respect. The decision point arrived quietly one evening as I reviewed my calendar for the upcoming months. I noticed how many of my commitments weren't actually mine. They were placeholders for availability, time I had left open just in case. Plans I'd kept flexible to accommodate needs that might arise. I imagined clearing them, not dramatically, just intentionally. That image brought a sense of relief so immediate, it surprised me. That was my answer. I chose the path that didn't require permission. This wasn't a rejection of my family. It was a refusal to continue subsidizing the imbalance with my silence. I wasn't demanding equality. I was reclaiming autonomy. From that point on, every choice was filtered through a different question. Does this align with who I am now, or with who I've been expected to be? If the answer was the latter, I paused. Sometimes I still choose to help. But help, when freely chosen, feels different. It doesn't hollow you out. It doesn't leave a residue of resentment. It feels clean. I also accepted that this decision would disappoint people, not because it was wrong, but because it disrupted expectations they'd grown comfortable with. Disappointment, I learned, isn't a moral failure. It's often just the echo of unmet entitlement. That understanding steadied me. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't justify it. I simply began living as though my time, energy, and dignity were finite resources, because they are. The irreversibility of the choice came from this. Once I stopped measuring my worth by how indispensable I was, I could never again be convinced that I owed my self-erasure to anyone. That belief, once gone, doesn't return. This was the point of no return, not because bridges were burned, but because I had crossed an internal line. I had chosen myself without waiting for validation. What came next wasn't immediate fallout. It was something slower, subtler, and more revealing. The consequences didn't arrive with noise. They arrived with an absence. After the decision, I didn't announce a new boundary or draw a line in the sand. I moved the way I always had, quietly. The difference was that this time, the quiet had direction. I stopped explaining my availability. When invitations came with assumptions baked in, I responded only to what was actually asked. When help was implied but not requested, I let the implication pass. When requests arrived, framed as urgency, I evaluated them on their merits instead of their tone. This wasn't coldness. It was discernment. Outwardly, it looked like nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. I also began to untangle myself from informal obligations that had never been named but were always expected. I reviewed recurring patterns, financial support that had become habitual, emotional labor that went unacknowledged, and last-minute problem-solving that positioned me as a default solution. One by one, I reduced my involvement, not abruptly, just enough that my absence would require others to adjust. What surprised me was how much effort I had previously been investing in keeping those systems running smoothly. Once I stepped back, the strain became visible, not because things broke immediately, but because the margin for error narrowed. That margin had been me. I was careful not to replace my old role with a new performance. I didn't adopt a tone of distance or superiority. I stayed polite, present, calm. The same version of me they recognized, just no longer bending around expectations that hadn't been agreed upon. Silence, in this phase, wasn't avoidance, it was alignment. I didn't preemptively reassure anyone that I was still supportive. I didn't rush to smooth over discomfort. I allowed pauses in conversation, gaps in response time, space where there used to be immediate accommodation. Those gaps did the work I used to do. Meanwhile, I took concrete steps to secure my independence further. I finalized plans I'd postponed for years, career moves, personal investments, long-term arrangements that prioritized stability over flexibility. These weren't secret. They were simply not broadcast. Quiet dominance isn't about hiding. It's about not needing permission. Legally, financially, practically, I ensured that my life no longer depended on maintaining harmony at my own expense. There were no dramatic shifts that anyone could point to, just a series of completed actions that reduced my vulnerability to expectation. No one commented on these changes directly, but I could feel the shift in how conversations unfolded. Requests were phrased more carefully. Check-ins became more frequent, though less specific. There was a subtle recalibration happening around me, even if no one named it. My brother, in particular, began to feel the difference. I didn't rush in to solve things before they escalated. I didn't translate his uncertainty into reassurance. I listened without fixing. That alone changed the dynamic. Not because I withdrew support, but because I stopped cushioning consequences. And cushioning had been a form of control, even if I hadn't seen it that way before. By stepping back, I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was allowing reality to function without my constant intervention. That shift was uncomfortable for them and clarifying for me. The hardest part of moving in silence was resisting the urge to explain myself. Years of conditioning had trained me to preempt misunderstanding, to manage perceptions, to smooth transitions. Letting go of that impulse felt risky at first, but the risk paid off. Without explanations, there was nothing to debate, no story to reinterpret, no emotional leverage to apply. My actions spoke plainly, and because they were consistent, they became the new baseline. I also noticed how much lighter I felt, not euphoric, just unburdened. Decisions no longer came with the hidden calculation of how they might affect someone else's sense of security. I was finally accounting for myself. This phase wasn't about punishment or withdrawal. It was about demonstrating through action that my presence was no longer guaranteed by habit. And once that becomes clear, relationships adjust or they strain. Either outcome tells you the truth. I didn't know yet which way my family would lean. I only knew that whatever happened next would be a response to reality, not to my silence. The consequences were already forming. They just hadn't been recognized yet. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced gradually in the spaces I no longer rushed to fill. At first, it was subtle, almost easy to miss. A plan that didn't quite come together. A delay that lingered longer than expected. A conversation that ended without resolution because no one stepped in to smooth it over. These weren't crises. They were inconveniences. And for the first time, they weren't mine to absorb. What changed wasn't the size of the problems. It was who carried the weight of them. My parents began to sound tired. Not dramatically so, just less assured. Their updates about my brother shifted in tone. Where there had once been confidence that things would work out, there was now uncertainty. Pauses in conversation where reassurance used to live. I listened. I didn't fix. That was new. They started asking questions that weren't really questions. Do you think he'll be okay? What would you do in this situation? In the past, those questions were invitations for me to step in, translate anxiety into action. This time, I answered honestly, but narrowly. I offered perspective, not solutions, observation, not intervention. And because I didn't move beyond that, the questions hung heavier than before. My brother felt it next. Without my quiet buffering, his mistakes landed more directly, not catastrophically, but undeniably. Missed deadlines weren't softened by my preemptive support. Financial gaps weren't quietly bridged. Emotional spirals weren't immediately reframed as temporary. He began reaching out more frequently, but with less certainty. The messages were longer, less confident. There was a searching quality to them, as if he were trying to locate the version of me who used to anticipate his needs. I was still there. I just wasn't reaching ahead of him anymore. At first, he seemed irritated, confused by the lack of immediate resolution. Then that irritation gave way to something else. Unease, because without my silent intervention, he was being asked to carry his own outcomes more consistently. Not by me, by reality. That's when the emotional temperature in the family shifted. Nothing exploded. No one accused me outright. Instead, there was a growing sense of imbalance. Not the old one that favored my brother, but a new one that revealed how much stability had been outsourced to me without acknowledgement. I could feel it in conversations that circled the same topics repeatedly, in suggestions that never quite became requests, in moments where someone clearly wanted me to step in, but didn't know how to ask without breaking the illusion that I always had. The most telling moment came during a family discussion that should have been routine. Plans were being made, timelines discussed, assumptions floated, and then, quietly, everything stalled. No one looked at me directly, but everyone waited. That silence used to be my cue. This time, I let it pass. Eventually, someone changed the subject. The plan moved forward, half-formed, less efficient, more fragile. And I saw it clearly then. The system was still trying to function as if I were operating behind the scenes, even though I wasn't. That's when discomfort turned into awareness. Not awareness of injustice, awareness of dependence. I wasn't confronted. I was missed. And being missed is far more unsettling to people than being challenged. The consequences weren't punishment, they were exposed. Exposure of how much had been built on my unspoken availability. How many outcomes had quietly relied on my restraint, my preparation, my willingness to take on more than my share. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel angry. I felt steady. For years, I had feared that stepping back would make me selfish, that things would fall apart, and I'd be responsible. But watching the consequences unfold, I realized something crucial. I hadn't caused the imbalance by stepping away. I had merely stopped hiding it. And once an imbalance is visible, it demands correction by those who benefit from it most. The tension in the family didn't come from loss of love. It came from the loss of convenience. That distinction mattered. As the days passed, the subtle pressure increased. Gentle reminders of how things used to work. Nostalgic references to smoother times. None of it is overt, all of it pointed. I acknowledged them politely, I didn't argue, because the consequences had already begun, and they were doing their work far more effectively than any explanation ever could. By the time anyone tried to fix what was happening, they were already addressing the wrong problem. The discomfort in my family had grown noticeable enough that it could no longer be brushed aside. Conversations became more deliberate. My parents called more often, not with emergencies, but with a careful attentiveness that hadn't been there before. They asked how I was doing. They checked in about work. They referenced things I'd mentioned weeks earlier, as if retroactive listening might restore the old balance. It was well-intentioned. It was also too late. What they were responding to wasn't my absence. It was their unease. The system they were used to had stopped functioning smoothly, and now they wanted to recalibrate without acknowledging why it had worked in the first place. My mother suggested we all talk things through. My father floated the idea of clearer expectations, of better communication moving forward. These weren't manipulative gestures. They were sincere attempts to regain stability. But stability without accountability is just repetition. What none of them named, what no one was prepared to confront, was the assumption underneath it all, that I would return to my old position once the discomfort became inconvenient enough. I listened, I didn't interrupt, I didn't argue, and that silence unsettled them more than resistance ever could have. They spoke about fairness as something we could rework going forward, about how no one meant for things to feel uneven, about how family dynamics are complicated and no one gets it right all the time. All of that was true, but it missed the point. The issue wasn't a misunderstanding. It was entitlement that had gone unexamined for too long. And entitlement, once exposed, doesn't disappear just because it's politely acknowledged. My brother tried next. His message was longer than usual, careful, self-aware, in a way I hadn't seen before. He admitted things hadn't been easy, that he knew he'd leaned on me, that he appreciated everything I'd done. Reading it, I felt a flicker of something, relief, maybe, or hope. But then I noticed what wasn't there. There was no recognition of choice, no acknowledgement that my support had been assumed rather than asked for, no understanding that what had changed wasn't my availability, but my consent. He wanted reassurance, closure, a return to emotional certainty. What he didn't want, what he couldn't yet offer, was a redefinition of the relationship that didn't center on his needs. And that was the moment I knew it was too late to fix things the old way. Not because I was unwilling to reconcile, but because reconciliation requires a shared understanding of what went wrong. Without that, all you're doing is restoring conditions that benefit the same people. I responded calmly, appreciatively, briefly. I didn't reject him. I also didn't promise anything. That ambiguity was new and uncomfortable for both of us. My parents tried again after that, softer this time. They framed their concern around me, asked if I was pulling away because I was overwhelmed, because I needed space, because something else was going on. They were searching for a reason that didn't require them to question the foundation they'd built on. I realized then that they weren't resisting change out of malice. They were resisting the implication that something they'd normalized for years had quietly harmed me. That's a difficult truth for any parent to face. I could have made it easier for them. I could have reassured them that nothing was wrong, that I was just busy, that things would settle, that I was still the same. But that would have been a lie. What had changed wasn't temporary. It wasn't a mood. It wasn't burnout. It was my understanding of myself. And once that shifts, there is no returning to a version of the relationship that depends on your silence. That's why it was too late. Not because repair was impossible, but because repair would require a level of honesty they weren't ready to engage with yet. Honesty about who benefited, who adjusted, who paid quietly. I wasn't angry about that. I was clear. I told them, gently, that I needed things to be different, not more balanced someday. Different now. That I wouldn't be stepping back into old patterns, even for the sake of comfort. There was a pause after that, a long one. In that pause, I could feel the finality settle, not as loss, but as reality. The moment when everyone realizes that the old arrangement isn't coming back, no matter how carefully they try to recreate it. Fixing something assumes it's broken. What we were facing wasn't breakage, it was exposure. And once something has been exposed, you can't cover it up and pretend it was never seen. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no dramatic declarations. If anything, it felt understated, almost ordinary, which I realized later was exactly why it worked. We were sitting at the same table we'd used for years. The setting was familiar enough to lull everyone into expecting a familiar outcome. Coffee cooled in untouched mugs. The conversation started with neutral ground. Work, schedules, surface level updates. It took a while before anyone addressed the thing we were all there for. My mother spoke first, carefully. She said she felt distance. Those things felt different, that she wanted to understand what had changed. I didn't rush to reassure her. I told her the truth, but not all at once. I said that I had been rethinking how I showed up, that I had realized I'd been doing a lot without ever being asked whether I wanted to, that I needed things to be more intentional going forward. There was a moment of confusion, genuine, not defensive. My father asked what I meant by a lot. I didn't list examples. I didn't recount years of imbalance. I didn't weaponize memory. Instead, I said something simple, that I had often been treated as the default solution, and that I was no longer willing to live that way. The room went quiet, not tense, processing. My brother shifted in his chair. He looked uncomfortable, but not surprised. When he spoke, his voice was careful. He said he never meant to take advantage of me, that he'd always assumed I was okay with how things were. That sentence landed exactly where it needed to. I told him I believed him. And I did. I said that intention wasn't the issue, assumption was. That something can be unintentional and still unfair. That my silence had been read as agreement, when in reality it had been habit. No one argued with that. What struck me was how little I needed to say. The power of the moment didn't come from revelation. It came from restraint. I wasn't trying to convince them. I was stating a reality they could either accept or resist. My mother asked what I wanted going forward. That was the question everything hinged on. I said I wanted my choices to be treated as choices. That help would be asked for, not expected. That my time and resources would no longer be considered communal by default, and that I wouldn't be explaining or defending those boundaries every time they were tested. There was no ultimatum in my voice, just clarity. They sat with that. My father nodded slowly. My brother looked down, then back up, as if recalibrating something internal. No one apologized theatrically. No one promised immediate transformation, and that was fine. This wasn't about emotional resolution. It was about structural change. What surprised me was how calm I felt throughout the conversation, not detached, present, grounded. I wasn't arguing for my worth. I was operating from it. That changed the tone entirely. There was a brief moment where my mother said, "We just didn't realize." I didn't contradict her. I also didn't soften the truth to make it easier. I said that realization now mattered more than intention then. Moving forward, things needed to reflect that awareness consistently, not just in words. The confrontation ended without ceremony. No hugs, no dramatic silence. Just a mutual understanding that something had shifted and that pretending otherwise wasn't an option anymore. Walking away from that table, I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. For the first time, my internal clarity matched my external behavior. There was no residue of guilt, no second guessing. I had said what needed to be said, and I had said it without heat. That, I learned, is what true confrontation looks like. Not explosive, not punishing, just immovable. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. It isn't a corrected version of my old self, sharpened by disappointment or hardened by distance. It's something quieter than that and more stable. I'm still calm, still reliable, still capable. Those traits didn't disappear when I stopped offering them indiscriminately. What changed was the direction they pointed in. For the first time in my life, they serve me first. I no longer measure my value by how little trouble I cause. I don't confuse being agreeable with being kind. And I don't mistake endurance for integrity. Those distinctions matter more than I ever realized. My relationship with my family didn't end. It changed shape. There's more space now, more pauses, fewer assumptions. Help, when it's asked for, is clearer and rarer. And when I offer it, it feels intentional, not obligatory. That difference is everything. It means I don't leave conversations feeling drained or invisible. I don't replay moments, wondering what I gave away without noticing. My brother is still figuring things out. That hasn't magically resolved, but the weight of that process no longer rests on my shoulders. He owns more of his outcomes now, not because I forced it, but because I stopped carrying them for him. Our interactions are less frequent, but more honest, less smooth, but more real. My parents are adjusting too, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes imperfectly. Old habits don't vanish overnight, but there's a noticeable restraint in how they approach me now. They ask more, assume less, and when they forget, I don't rush to compensate. I let the moment teach what words no longer need to. As for me, the biggest change is internal. I no longer feel the need to justify my boundaries. I don't explain myself preemptively. I don't manage other people's discomfort as a default setting. When something doesn't align, I notice it, and I choose accordingly. That choice has simplified my life. I invest my time differently now. My energy goes into work that reflects my values, relationships that respect my autonomy, and routines that don't require me to disappear in order to function. I still give, but I give from surplus, not depletion. There's no bitterness in that, only discernment. I've also let go of the fantasy that fairness will eventually emerge on its own if you're patient enough. Fairness isn't automatic. It's negotiated, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through action. And if you don't participate in that negotiation, you don't stay neutral. You lose by default. That realization didn't make me cynical. It made me precise. I'm more present now because I'm not performing presence. I'm not the stabilizer by default. I'm a person with preferences, limits, and agency, and that's visible in how I move through the world. People respond to that. Some lean in with respect, others pull back. Both reactions are informative. What I've learned is this: when you stop being useful at your own expense, you find out who values you beyond your function. That knowledge is quiet, but it's liberating. I don't need to be central in anyone's life to feel secure. I don't need to be indispensable to feel worthy. And I don't need to be silent to be loved. Who I am now is someone who understands that dignity isn't loud, but it's not invisible either. It's present in choices made consistently, without drama, without apology. I didn't become someone else. I became someone who finally stands where I am. There's a quiet lie many of us grow up with, especially inside families, that call themselves loving and well-intentioned. The lie isn't shouted. It isn't cruel. It sounds reasonable enough that you rarely question it. It says, if you're capable, you should give more. If you're stable, you should adjust. If you're strong, you should absorb the weight so others don't have to. And slowly, without ever agreeing to it outright, you're taught that your dignity is a kind of debt, something you repay by staying silent, by being easy, by not asking for too much. But here's the truth I learned the hard way. Debt of dignity doesn't exist. Not to parents who meant well, not to siblings who struggled more visibly, not to anyone who benefited from your endurance without noticing its cost. Support given freely is love. Support assumed indefinitely is an entitlement. What changed my life wasn't confrontation or distance. It was clarity. The moment I stopped confusing my ability to endure with my obligation to do so, everything recalibrated. Not instantly, not painlessly, but honestly. Some people adjusted, some felt uncomfortable, some relationships grew quieter. None of that meant I was wrong. It meant the old system depended on my silence more than I ever realized. There's a version of strength we're rarely taught, the kind that doesn't rescue, doesn't explain, doesn't rush to smooth things over. The strength that simply stands still and lets reality speak for itself. That strength isn't loud. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't seek revenge. It just refuses to disappear. If you've listened this far and recognized yourself in this story, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not selfish for wanting reciprocity. You are not cold for setting boundaries. And you are not cruel for stepping out of roles you never consented to. You don't owe your peace to someone else's expectations. You don't owe your future to someone else's potential. And you don't owe your dignity to anyone, no matter how close they are to you. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop performing the version of yourself that made other people comfortable. Not to punish them, but to finally be honest with yourself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who was told to understand while carrying more than your share, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever realized that the role you were praised for was the same one that kept you invisible?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.